It's that time of year to start heading to the nursery to buy our bedding plants, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the array of color that is offered at the nurseries. But before we start looking at the flowers and the colors, there's a few things I want you to consider when buying your bedding plants. Most bedding plants need just either potting soil or regular soil to grow in. But the first thing that you want to consider is where you're going to be planting these plants when you get home. What sort of environment do you have to offer these plants? Are you looking for something for full sun, maybe in full shade? Are you looking for something in a rock garden or a container? Think about those things and what you can offer the plant, what sort of environment you're asking that plant to grow in. The next thing you want to consider is what you're asking of the plant. Do you want something that's trelling, such as this tangerine vine here? Perhaps you want a lower growing ground cover, such as this gold dust with these lovely yellow flowers. Once you decide what it is, what features you're asking of the plant and looking for in the plant, you can also think about the color that you're wanting to get. And you've narrowed it down to the specific plant. It's time to start picking that plant up off the bench. So often when we pick a plant up off the bench, they're grouped together and they look good in mass, and you go to pick the one that you think is the best, and it turns out to be a little bit smaller. There's a few things to consider when you're buying that and picking that plant. You can see here we have a deep purple salvia. This plant is really a nice plant. You might notice that all of the vegetation is growing towards one side, and that's probably because where it was placed in the greenhouse, the sun exposure was on one side of it. It might have been near the edge of a bench. It might have had more plants pushed up against it, and so that caused it to grow in one direction. This isn't too much of a concern because once you put it out in the garden, it's going to fill out and look nice. Now, obviously, this one is pretty small. You can see it's been overwatered. There's some mold growing on the leaves and things like that. So this is one that you would want to avoid. Here we have another plant, this verbena. You can just see that there's not any new growth coming on this plant. It's kind of past its prime. All of the flowers are starting to fade on here. The leaves have some discoloration and they're much smaller and stunted looking. So we know that something has happened previously and it's not really in good health right now. Now here's another plant, this geranium. It looks pretty good, and I tend to focus on the new growth. The new growth is coming on strong. However, again, it has some discolored leaves down below. So that might be something that you just want to avoid if you can. Again, typically a good plant, but if you can avoid some of these leaves, do that. Here's another plant, and at first glance it might look good, but taking a closer look at the leaves, you'll see that there's some holes in those leaves. And that's because there's grasshopper damage. And in fact, we can see we have small grasshoppers that are still on this plant. Now, again, a grasshopper is going to jump away. It's not a major threat. We already have them out in our garden likely. But why buy a plant that already has damage on it if you can avoid it? Now, knowing your plant is important because here you might think something is going on with these leaves because they obviously kind of range in color, but this is actually how the plant is supposed to look. This is copper leaf, and the cultivar is called Inferno, and it can range from kind of this yellow to red to almost a purple burgundy on the leaf. So this is how the plant is supposed to look. So you might look at the mass of plant and see what maybe is standing out. All of these plants have this range of color to them, so you know that's kind of typical on this plant. Again, when you're buying a plant, you might find that it's lopsided. So here we have a blue daze. It tends to grow more towards the left side of the pot. This plant would be a good spiller in a container because you can see how the foliage kind of drops over the edge of the pot. If you're worried about the fact that this side of the plant isn't growing, again, given enough room on the proper spacing, it will fill out nicely. It's just that real estate in a greenhouse is pretty expensive, so sometimes these plants are a little bit closer than they need to be out in the landscape. After you've looked at the upper growth of a plant, you want to look at what's going on underneath the plant, and you want to do this carefully. So this plant, you can see it's got a lot of new growth. This is a cleome. We've got some buds coming on. It looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead, we put our fingers between the stems and gently turn it over and give the pot a tap. Now, if it's got a good amount of roots, and you don't need to necessarily pull the pot completely off, but you can see it's got a fair amount of white roots. Those are healthy roots. There is a little bit of circling going on with the roots, so if we were to take this plant home, we would want to tease those roots a little bit to separate them. But this has got a good root system to it. A plant that obviously is suffering, such as this one here, it might have just been potted up into this, because it's a fairly small plant for this pot. You can see we don't see any roots, so we really don't know what's going on with this plant. Perhaps it's died back, perhaps it's been overwatered too much and the roots haven't grown well. But just know that if you're to buy a smaller plant and you don't see any roots underneath that plant, then the odds are that it might just have been potted up into that larger pot. But you're buying more potting soil than you are actually a plant. Here's a little lemon drop basil. Again, we're going to kind of tip this over and see. And you want to be careful because you don't want to mess up people's plants, but you can see that the soil is coming out, so we know that it's not rooted very well in that pot. Here's another one that I'll show you. It's rooted fairly decently. It could grow some more. There's no circling or anything, but this is a good plant and some good healthy roots growing there. After you've looked at the upper part of the plant and taken a peek at what's going on in the pot, then it's time to go back and look at those flowers. A lot of times, if I know a plant is the color that it's said to be, then I go ahead and buy a plant that's not in bloom. Just buying one with buds allows you to take that home and have a little bit more flower power in your own landscape. Now, if you're concerned that you might buy a plant and it might not be the true color that it says it is, you know, sometimes I've bought a clematis and it tends to be a different color than what they said it was. You might want to make sure to buy one that has a flower on it so you can ensure that you're getting the exact color that you want. So once you've determined where you're going to plant in your garden and what you're looking for in a plant when you get to the nursery, make sure to inspect both the top and the bottom for the health. This will give you the best purchase of bedding plants.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.